Whoa, stop. This is part 2 of, I don't know how many parts this series is going to be, honestly. I think this might be the last one, but point is you should go watch part 1. What, you, like, watch movie series, like, halfway through? Like a little freak? Go watch part 1 first. What are you doing? And for everybody else who's here who has watched part 1, what? You expected another a high-level edited opening? You have any idea how long those take to make?
Here we go again.
It took 34,000 trillion watts of energy.
The image itself is also a photographic negative, which would be almost impossible to create as a forgery in the 13th century because that technology was not known back then.
For example, on the shroud we have blood all over it. It's type AB blood, which is Semitic blood.
Pollens that they found in the cloth were from that region.
Yeah. Okay, so what happened? Why did episode 1 end so abruptly? And the answer is that all of the footage I had after that point was straight up garbage. Yeah, straight up garbage. And I apologize for that. I didn't have the time to re-edit it. I was busy with my school and so on, so the video just ended abruptly. But we're here with part 2. When this comes out, after some time, I'll take the 2 and edit it together so that way it'll be like a full documentary that you can watch and all in one go. We're going to pick right back up with images. I want to direct your attention to, nope, wrong way, to this little thing I have on my table. Now, as you can clearly see from looking at the piece of Tupperware I have in between these 2 cloths, that preferential treatment and bias on the image is going to be given to the item being covered. Now, in the case of a human body, it's going to be a little more wrapped. Obviously, a piece of Tupperware is not the same as a human body. But I'm hoping this illustrates for people 2 big things. The most distortion we should see is on the front-facing side. The least amount of distortion we should see is on the back-facing side, or where the back of the person would be. Why is this important? Because the Shroud of Turin is not just the famous front-facing side. It's also the back-facing side. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that the vast majority of people who have looked at the Shroud of Turin have not actually bothered to take a look at the difference between the front and the back. As we can clearly see in this image here, the back of the shroud is actually taller than the front of the shroud, which, illustrating from any general object, should not happen. In fact, length in general really shouldn't see a lot of variation. It's more or less width that should be stretched out, not length. But as you can see in this image, especially on the green line, the top of the head is several inches taller than the front of the head on both images. So what we're seeing here is that the figure is not consistent on both ends of the shroud. On top of this, there are 2 major discrepancies that have gone completely untouched by the majority of commentators here, and the first one of those would be image consistency. Now, what do I mean when I say image consistency? Well, the Shroud of Turin is a long piece of fabric laid end to end. So it's supposed to be one piece of fabric that went underneath the individual, over his head, and then onto the front. Why is this important? Well, as you can see, the front and the back of the image imparted anatomical realities about his hair, which is a problem if it's real. You see, there should actually be a continuous hair signature on the top end where the back and the front should actually connect together. So the figure should be a singular figure. Mysteriously, it's not, which is a huge red flag if you're a Shroud believer, because then you have to believe that the image was created through miraculous means, but then miraculously also did not actually consistently create an image. So why doesn't the front and the back adequately connect in an image? Well, a better, more scientific explanation would be that these are two separate low-relief rubbings of two separate individuals, which is why they make two different heights and they don't connect. There is an additional problem with the image of the Shroud, and its consistency with the feet on the Shroud, believe it or not. Take a look at the back foot facing us. So that would be the bottom right. I'm autistic, so rights and lefts are kind of hard for me, but I believe it's the right foot. Left on the front, right on the back. Okay. As you can see here, the image is clearly telling us that the foot of the Shroud is pressed into the cloth. However, when we flip the Shroud on its face, the foot is now facing upwards. That is a contradiction. Essentially, what we are getting is the back image showing us this, and the front image showing us this. That's not physically possible. So the notion that the Shroud image is even consistent all throughout is just not correct. If you take a look at 3D interpretations of this figure, they actually vary on this because there's no actual consistency. With that, let's move on to... Now, I'm going to be I'm going to be pretty real with you. The Pollen claims surrounding the Shroud are just out for lunch. I've never seen this level of misinformation for pretty much any other topic in my life. The things people are saying about the nature of pollen are just... they just strain incredulity. But we're going to try and be as fair and unbiased as we can possibly be. So let's start with a couple of factual realities. Number one, is it possible for a plant to be regionally locked, even locked to specific cities? Yes. The answer is yes. It is possible for specific plants to be locked to an exclusive region. Is it possible for pollen to be locked to a specific region? The problem with this claim is not that it's impossible. Okay? The problem with this claim is that it's heavily context dependent. What plant are we talking about? Where in the world is it from? Plant pollen tends to travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from its point of origin. So, for instance, the pollen on Easter Island is unique to Easter Island because it's probably going to end up in the ocean elsewhere where it won't be found, right? The same cannot be said for Jerusalem. Not only is Jerusalem not regionally locked in any special way, but it was also a highway for a lot of trade and war. So there's a lot of material coming in and out of the city of Jerusalem, so much so that it's not geographically unique. There are no special occurrent flowers occurring in Jerusalem. And this is important because one of the biggest claims I've seen on the internet is that pollen collected from the Shroud shows that it is exclusively from the Middle East. And this is just not true. There is no pollen sample that was ever collected from the Shroud that definitively demonstrated that it was exclusively from the Middle East. And in fact, if you ask any Shroud advocates specifically what pollen was acquired, they will not tell you. So let's go over more of the harder claims versus the overview that I just gave. So, pollen has been reported on the Shroud. This is true. This is just true. We did indeed find pollen on the Shroud. Max Fry collected pollen-bearing materials from the shroud using adhesive tape in his 1973 and 1978 studies. That's just it. Okay? No one has ever contested this. His findings in his paper, while they're old and outdated at this point, really to contest it is just nonsense. The shroud's most abundant pollen, however, was misidentified. This is true. Originally, it was identified as Gundelia, but more recent studies have actually suggested that it's Helichrysum. This is a specific counterclaim made by Marisa Boy after comparing published imagery in modern reference pollen under LM and SEM, arguing most abundant pollen may fit the Helichrysum rather than the Gundella turniforti. The pollen assemblage supports a Middle Eastern Levantine origin. This provenience inference does exist in the literature. It stems from Boy, but Boy's paper frames a much earlier provenience narrative as requiring reinterpretation and argues for an alternative mechanism, such as ointments or handling, rather than simple geographic origin inference, meaning that there's no way to actually prove the provenience of the object based off of the pollen we actually find. Another contested claim is that species-level ID from shroud and pollen records are reliable enough to do geography. This plant only grows here. I already asserted this in the introduction, but it's a little more than that. It is a slightly contested topic, as I have sort of implied. Scientific discussion that relies on legacy image samples runs on basic epistemic problems. Species-level pollen ID from limited legacy imagery is often not secure, and Boy's paper is an example of how key IDs can be reassessed. So, if you want to believe some sort of reality about the pollen, that's completely fine. It is in the contested category, but I would not put significant weight on it. It's not a particularly good thing to talk about if you want to talk about the legitimacy of the shroud. In the contested leaning false category, we have pollen distributed density on the shroud cannot be explained by ordinary contamination handling, therefore implies direct contact with flowering plants in antiquity. As I said at the beginning of this series, if there's no citation, it's going to contested leaning false. There is no citation, therefore it's contested leaning false. Pollen proves a specific travel route: Jerusalem, Edessa, Constantinople, France, Italy. This is completely out of line. The pollen samples we have do not in any way suggest a specific travel route. I can find no citation that determined this, no study that determined this. This is a claim exclusively peddled by grifters. I'm sorry to be this blunt about it, but that's just the reality of the situation. And finally, we have the penultimate false claim. Pollen proves the shroud is authentic, ergo first century burial shroud. Even if pollen is present, pollen evidence is not uniquely diagnostic of authenticity. It can be consistent with multiple histories, ergo handling, later contact, environmental deposition, and the literature itself treats this interpretation as disputed rather than dispositive, meaning it's false. It's not true. There is no pollen sample that has definitively proven that the Shroud of Turin is from Jerusalem. Let's talk about some iconographic and art history claims. Now, I already said that I'm not a historian, so outside of everything else I've already talked about, take just a little bit of grain of salt with everything I say here. Someone with a little more practice in history might be able to correct me on this, and if I do get anything wrong, feel free to correct me. Now, one of the big problems with iconographic arguments is that they're heavily interpretation dependent, ergo they're subjective. So Casabianca explicitly frames iconographic analysis in the Prey Codex controversy as inherently subjective and shows how disputes persist even among informed parties. The Prey Codex is a non-trivial visual correspondence with the Shroud, but the inference is it depicts the Shroud is debated. So the Prey Codex apparently has an image of the Shroud in it. But there is no direct link actually demonstrating that this is the case. The mandolin image of Edessa was the Shroud, folded to show only the face. The historiography work argues that frequent identification of the Shroud with the mandolin brought from Edessa to Constantinople in 944 AD is impossible, with the reasoning that the two relics were simultaneously present in Constantinople. They cannot be the same object under that reconstruction. Separately, Nicoletti's academic press monograph is explicitly about the mandolin to Shroud metamorphosis and manipulation of the legend, which aligns with treating the identification as historically problematic. These are uncited claims. Byzantine coins were copied from the Shroud. There were 140 points of convergence proving Shroud access pre-1200s. No citation. Vignon markings, no citation. Early Christian art reflects Shroud facial features, implying Shroud knowledge from the beginning. No citation. Iconography alone proves the authenticity. This is, of course, false. In fact, if anything, iconography demonstrates the opposite, that it can't be real. Now, Byzantine art is fairly popular in the Christian world. Depictions of Christ and as he looked are pretty popular from that artistic perspective. If anything, it proves that the art used to inspire the Shroud of Turin is fictitious, and thus the Shroud itself is also fictitious. I want to talk a little bit about cognitive bias before I progress to the big problems with the Shroud of Turin and then concluding thoughts. It's been a real struggle talking to Shroud believers about the Shroud of Turin. And I know I promised that this wasn't going to be some sort of big old debunk video. But at this point, I think it's pertinent to bring this up because even though I have been neutral or have done my best to peter out any biases I may or may not have, it may feel to some Shroud believers that I am simply making a debunking video that is secretly pretending to not be a debunking video. And I think that would be a result of cognitive bias. Now, what is cognitive bias? Cognitive bias is a systemic deviation from rational judgment in thinking and decision-making. It is not random error. It is a predictable pattern in how the brain simplifies information processing under constraints like limited time, incomplete data, environmental investment, or evolutionary heuristics. From a cognitive science perspective, biases arise because the brain uses mental shortcuts. These heuristics are efficient but can distort probability assessment, causal inference, and belief formation. Why is this important for us to discuss? Because the vast majority of Shroud believers that I talk to about the scientific reality are approaching the Shroud from the perspective that it is already real, and then assuming the science, most of which we've gone over, supports it. And I think that that is epistemically dishonest. Let us suppose, for an example, that the Shroud was 100% real. It was truly the burial shroud of the Christ, Rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef HaMashiach. Okay? Would it not be in our best interest to have the single highest level of skepticism possible so that it passes those tests. Instead, what we get are people who don't even understand how 3 dimensions on a 2D plane work, telling us that the distortions make sense when they don't. We get people telling us about type AB blood being Semitic blood when it's not. And that somehow Pollen from the Shroud can tell us where it went and where it didn't when it can't. None of these things in isolation are crimes. There's no crime in wanting to believe something is true, okay? And in order to extend an olive branch, I'm going to talk about a personal belief of mine here and now. I am a firm believer that skinwalkers are real. No, this is not a joke. I'm not pretending. I can't prove it. Okay? I can't prove it. There's something out in the woods, and it's going to eat me, and I think it's a skinwalker. Is that completely irrational? Yeah, probably. Do I look stupid for saying it in this video? Probably. But it's okay to sound silly. It's okay to sound stupid. It's okay to believe things. Again, none of these things in on themselves are actual crimes. No one should be shamed for any of that. But when we're talking about the scientific reality, misrepresenting that reality with a presupposition does nothing but hurt the conversation. Suppose we encounter someone who is agnostic and not science literate. They hear from their local pastor that the Shroud of Turin is a 100% legitimate object. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. Until they learn it's not. Then what's the message? That our faith is a lie. That the things that we have to do in order to maintain our faith are lies, and that we're willing to misrepresent academic realities, destroy nuance in contested categories, and not care about the overall problems in order to push a narrative. Then that individual, who very well could have been among us, no longer is. Responsibility with the information is one of the single most important things possible. Anybody epistemically honest ought to understand this, which means that we shouldn't be operating with an assumption that it's real or an assumption that it's fake for that matter. Proper analysis requires that we overlook our cognitive bias, and this is what has made talking to Shroud believers so frustrating. The insistence that someone like me has a strong disbelief in the Shroud versus the reality that I am epistemically honest about the Shroud. Do I sound a little mad about it? I am mad about it a little bit because I think it's an unfair characterization. And quite frankly, it's irresponsible for anybody to try and dismiss what other people are saying based off of these realities. So what if I'm biased? Let's go ahead and engage with the idea that I am biased. Does it magically make all the science I've talked about wrong? If so, disprove it. If not, then why not be a little more genuine with the reality? Shroud hoaxers, by the way, are not innocent on this. There's plenty of problems with the idea that the Shroud is also a hoax. We already went over the photography one, but other people claim that it's like, some sort of malicious plot. Like, what evidence is there for that? There is none. All in all, when we talk about delicate topics like this, some people tend to let their personally held beliefs run amok over the conversation rather than letting the facts speak for themselves first. If this were an object with a high level of interpretations, honestly, I wouldn't be making this section of the video. But I am, because as we progress to the big problem section, cognitive bias tends to take over. So what are the big problems? Well, big problem number one is that the Shroud of Turin has been reproduced. Now let's be clear here before I go over this one paper. The purpose of the paper was not to prove how the shroud was made, only to prove that someone of the medieval ages could have made it, which are two separate claims. In his 2010 paper, a life-sized reproduction of the Shroud of Turin in its image, posted in the Journal of Imaging and Science Technology, Luigi Garlasciali? If I butchered your last name, which I probably did, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that. Pretty much recreates the Shroud of Turin. Now, I have shown this paper to several Shroud believers, and the answer is universally the same thing, that it doesn't 100% reproduce the Shroud. And to that I say, the Shroud is 600 years old. Of course it doesn't reproduce the Shroud. It would need to age 600 years in order for it to look even remotely close to the original thing. On top of that, one does not need to reproduce the Shroud 100% to demonstrate that it is not reproducible. All one needs to do is reproduce the general phenomena of the Shroud in order to demonstrate that it can indeed be reproduced, which is exactly what this paper does. It reproduces the Shroud and its image. The reproduction of this image in this paper is so pristine it even created its own negative, just like the real Shroud of Turin. It shows 3D correlation under grayscale processing, like the real Shroud. It resides on the topmost fibers, like the real Shroud. It consists of yellowed cellulose, oxidized cellulose, like the real Shroud. It lacks obvious pigment buildup, like the real Shroud. It does not fluoresce under UV. This would be because he didn't use any blood to paint on it. If he did, it would. So how did he do this? Well, he did it via rubbing, not painting. A common straw man among believers is that skeptics claim that the Shroud was painted on. I actually haven't really seen this from any skeptic, at least any skeptic I know of that's informed on the topic. I've seen some YouTube Mr. Atheist types that have claimed that it's painted. And for clarity, there's no evidence that it's been painted on, so that's just nonsense. However, the way they produced this image is by rubbing. So they would take the pigment in question and they would just simply rub it over the Shroud like you would do with like a pencil and like a, like a piece of paper that you put on like a bumpy thing. That's basically what they did with the Shroud. The results are a reproduction of the Shroud of Turin. There's really nothing else to really say about it. They used a cobalt blue pigment mixed with diluted sulfuric acid, 1 to 1.3%, applied as slurry, heated it to 140 degrees, washed the cloth, and observed a faint yellow-brown image remaining. In terms of methodology, it's pretty good methodology. He goes over exactly how he created the Shroud. Anyone can reproduce it at their home, assuming they have the correct materials. Very transparent procedure. It even gives you specific temperatures and concentrations, acknowledges its limitations, which is very good, and demonstrates physical plausibility. Why do we care about the Shroud in this video is that it's frequently said that no one's been able to reproduce the Shroud, and yet we have. It's been reproduced for 16 years. I view this as big problem number one. It's major stumbling block number one. Anyone who wishes to convince me of the Shroud of Turin needs to address this paper adequately without cognitive bias. And indeed, everyone I have shown this paper to has just demonstrated cognitive bias. They'll say it hasn't reproduced this specific feature, even though that could have been a thing. Again, if you can reproduce the image, you can reproduce the art. So that's not a good argument in response. Before we leave this particular paper, let's go over the limitations. The blood first image second stratigraphy does not show up on the shroud because blood wasn't used. There's no paper continuing this work. I don't know where Luigi is at the moment. I hope he's doing well. Someone reach out to him and ask him to just do this again with the blood. I don't know what else to tell you. Exact 3D encoding behavior, absent of all pigment traces and high magnification. Exact fluorescent spectrum matching. What that means is that if you take a look at the negative fluorescence and the non-negative fluorescence of the shroud versus the reproduction, they're not an exact 1-to-1. Perfect anatomical consistency? No. But then again, as we've gone over, the shroud itself doesn't have perfect anatomical consistency, so. Continuous head-body formation from one physical process. He openly states, no accelerated aging technique can replicate centuries of natural aging. The aim is plausibility, no perfect reproduction. Big problem number 2 is what I'm going to call the lineup production, and it goes over some science we already went over. Ask yourself, what are the odds that the historical provenience of the shroud lines up with the carbon dating, but neither of those are factual? Well, I'll tell you, the answer is 0. Understand what we are effectively saying when we suggest that the shroud is from the 1st century. The shroud, which, as I highlighted in part 1 with the sandwich bag of miracles, which you may have noticed has completely disappeared, the reasoning for that just had to be that looking back on it, I don't like the bit, so I got rid of it halfway through. Understand what we are saying when we say it's from the 1st century. Putting aside all the miracles that supposedly could have happened, even though that strains incredulity, okay? We are saying that the shroud, the single most miraculous object to have ever occurred in human history, occurred in the 1st century. And then it disappeared for 1,300 years, only to have mysteriously cropped back up. And when it mysteriously crops back up, the carbon dating mysteriously lines up with that cropping back up. The answer is it's virtually impossible for this to have happened. Okay? If we wanted to be optimistic, it's like a 1% chance that this could happen. If we wanted to be more realistic, it's a 0.1% chance. If you wanted to be skeptical, it's a 0.01% chance. The lineup problem is so powerful because when you go over the actual arguments for why it's from the 1st century and realize that they are not particularly powerful, the solid grounding that it should be from the 1st century starts to collapse. We have definitive evidence that it's from the 13th to 14th century, not before and not after. On a side note, I have seen people talk about herringbone 3-to-1 weave, as if that proves that it's not from the 1st century. This is actually not true. Herringbone 3-to-1 weave does indeed occur in ancient Judean textiles. However, let's take a look at those textiles. Here's one from the actual 1st century, and here's the Shroud of Turin. Notice anything? Well, yes, they are radically different in quality, because one of them is actually from the 1st century. I don't know what to tell you. If the Shroud of Turin is from the 1st century, it should look like the one from the 1st century. It should look like 1st century shrouds, but it doesn't look like 1st century shrouds. I'm going to go over a couple of little corrections before I move on to conclusions. In part 1, I said that cellulose does not have consistent crystallographic structure. Just off a hunch, I decided to double check that, and believe it or not, that's actually not true. Cellulose does have consistent crystallographic structure. However, it does not have consistent aging and degradation. So the point I was making is ultimately still correct, but the crystallographic axis part of it is just not as strong as I made it out to be early. That's a mistake on my part. Sorry. Another thing that I wasn't clear about is that when I made those calculations as to the odds of the invisible weave occurring, it's important to note that those are qualitative calculations, not quantitative calculations, because we only have a quantity of 1. So it's impossible to calculate past that. Does that make that point wrong? Not necessarily, no. It does make it slightly weaker than I make it out to be in part 1. Still a valid point, but not as ironclad as I was really hoping that it would be looking back on it. All right. Concluding thoughts. Honestly, I've been struggling to think of a good conclusion for this video. Because I have a sneaking suspicion that people who really believe in the Shroud are going to feel unfairly treated. They're going to feel as though a biased narrator came in, tried debunking their thing, and it's a really difficult thing to address, ain't it? Because I think most people are very much interested in having a correct worldview. Most people just want their beliefs to be in line with the facts. And it's convenient to allow sweeping ideas, new finds that are not really well put together yet, or even just the hype of it all, to take us away and convince us that that's what reality is, like a hyper-real simulacra that we all choose to live in. I began the beginning of this video saying that I don't have any strong feelings about the Shroud of Turin. And as I make this conclusion, it occurs to me that if that were even true, I wouldn't have made a video like this. So why do I actually care? And the answer would be because the Shroud of Turin acts as a microcosm for science literacy in the religious world. Now, I am going to admit here that I am a minority voice, but I also happen to be highly educated on the sciences. So as a man of faith who is highly educated in the sciences, this is an important topic to me. And that's what makes the Shroud of Turin, the conversation surrounding it, and the level of engagement I've been getting about it so important. It doesn't stop here. As other people have seen in my videos, there's misinformation about evolution. There's misinformation about archaeology. There's misinformation about a lot of things. And the thing that bothers me the most, it's just not necessary. You know, does the Shroud need to be legitimate? If yes, why? And if not, then why not just accept the science for what it says? If the Shroud is not real, what is lost? I want anybody who believes in the Shroud of Turin, who got this far in the video series, to genuinely answer that question down below in the comments. Engage with me, but don't lie to me. And that's another problem I have, is that when people are corrected on something, they'll simply choose to not tell the truth about it. Like, I had someone once tell me that Pollen doesn't travel hundreds of thousands of miles. And then when I asked them, well, how does it end up in ice cores in Antarctica then? They just told me that it doesn't end up in ice cores in Antarctica and that I was lying, which is just bonkers. Anybody can just Google the fact that we find pollen in ice cores. It's just not true. The Shroud of Turin is probably one of the most talked about objects in the modern era, but it is also unfortunately a victim of theater and propaganda. Having assessed the entirety of the scientific claims of the Shroud of Turin, there is not enough positive evidence to even remotely suggest that it is at all a legitimate first century object. Does that mean that people who believe that it is ought to be mocked or ridiculed? Well, no, of course not. Does it mean that they should receive sufficient pushback when they double down and refuse to accept the science? Maybe. There might be a conversation to be had in regards to that. Does it justify people doing tours, giving talks, and continuously spreading this misinformation while making money off of it? No. That's disgusting. That's taking people's faith and making money off of it by holding it hostage. And it does nothing but spread anti-academic sentiment. I'm looking at a particular doctor when I say that. No, not to anybody I sent this video to. He's a very famous guy who likes to talk about the Shroud a lot. This video is not for any personal assassination, but I just wanted to make it clear how I felt about a certain someone. If you know, you know. If you don't, I'm not going to personally attack anyone in this video. That's not what this is for. Anyway, thank you for watching part 1 and part 2. If there's anything I potentially missed, put it down in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to make a part 3. Other than that, this concludes elucidating the Shroud of Turin. So where do we go from here? Well, honestly, I had a lot of fun researching this topic. I had a lot of fun researching this object. If you take a look at my channel's posts, you'll see that I even made my own little Shroud of Turin. It didn't really turn out the way I wanted it to. My assistant was not particularly helpful on that, so I didn't use it in the actual video. But it goes to show that I do put a lot of effort into learning about these things so that way I can properly talk about them from a neutral perspective. And I went into this video trying to do everything I could to give the pro-Shroud side as much room as I possibly could, even though I, by default, do not think that the Shroud was legitimate. So, I'm going to put a vote on my channel as to what the next elucidating video should be on. If I don't get any votes, I will default to elucidating the archaeological findings of Ron Wyatt. Thank you for watching, and Shalom Aleichem.